motion, you may think that this debate is about whether or not deep-sea mining should exist. Don't be fooled. In both worlds, both team opposition and proposition, deep-sea mining still exists. But only we ensure that it is in the safest way possible with a regulatory framework. That is why we're so proud to propose. Starting with some points of setup, firstly on rare earth minerals themselves. This refers to 17 specific metallic elements, which are used for many things in the status quo. Some examples of this are, for example, military tech for many countries, and for clean energy alternatives that are so prevalent in the status quo, such as, for example, electric vehicles, solar panels, and so many more. This means that they are increasing in demand consistently into this world. That is why there has been a deep interest in pursuing deep-sea mining. What does this interest look like? It looks like countries pushing for its legalization. It looks like many states exploring international waters with the approval of the International Seabed Authority, and specifically it looks like the United States giving its own licenses to mine. This moves us to our second point of setup on the sense of urgency. If we don't take action immediately, this action from the United States will set a precedent and encourage the other states to pursue deep-sea mining without the adequate framework that we bring through legislation. This framework is completely important to make sure that deep-sea mining is done responsibly and without harming the environment and the seabed. This framework preserves the environmental well-being. But more on that in our argument. Now, we anticipate that opposition will bring a point on how there is uncertainty, on how the draft is not finished yet, and legalizing it would not be careful on our side. Now, we would say that this is actually not true. Over the last 10 years, there has been so much research, discussion, and consideration of every possible scenario. The 55 first regulations of the International Seabed Authority Mining Code have been approved. And then, as we are speaking, the other 51 are being discussed. Not the content, not the science behind it, but where to put the comma to make the final draft. This is happening soon, panel. We call for immediate approval because it is the only way to protect a healthy environment and to prevent other actors from breaking the international system. But now, on how our legalization looks like. We would approve the draft that is currently being finalized in order to give a regulatory framework that allows for this deep-sea mining to happen in a way that is that we take care of the environment before the states do it without a framework and push for this to create some chaos. So we'll be proving this through two main arguments. The first one called now or never. Our second argument called a green world through a blue planet. I will be delivering the first two, and our second speaker will be giving an extension on the second argument. So starting with our first argument, now or never. The thesis of this argument is that legalizing deep-sea mining immediately is the only way to protect a healthy environment and prevent actors from breaking the international system. Note how this may bring on an opposition point on how our motion brings instability and brings the deep-sea mining to become reckless or to harm the environment. Now, this argument proves how it actually does the exact opposite. In the status quo, the United States is closer than ever to starting extractions in the seabed. This looks like their investigation on the Clipperton zone, or the company, the metals company, the American metals company, pursuing and exploring deep sea in order to pursue its own deep sea mines. Now, extracting rare earth minerals has a lot of purposes, as we mentioned in our setup, but they do it mostly for military purposes. I'll give you one example, panel. Yttrium, which is essential for radar-absorbent materials and used for stealth tech, used in the military of the United States. Why is this problematic? Because it pushes for the armamentistic race for other states. It encourages other countries to begin their own deep-sea exploration without the regulation that we would have on our counterpart in order to remain competitive. This is important because they would want to mitigate the United States strategic advantage. They are forced to do this. Countries to remain competitive and not have a United States leverage would be forced to do this. Now, how do we avoid this problem on our side? Firstly, we disincentivize countries to provide their own licenses. Why is this? Because they would now be a part of a treaty that imposes their own rulings. The International Seabed Authority is the only body that knows where the protected areas are in order to ensure that we are not harming any environmental ecosystem inside the seabed. This is exclusive to our side. On their side, mining will still happen, but without the protection and without the regulatory framework that protects these sensitive areas. But secondly, we disincentivize private partners from getting non-viable licenses. When we delay this, as team opposition will try to argue that it's better, companies will seek licenses from small Pacific states, such as, for example, as we see in the case of now giving the licenses. So these licenses are much more poorly regulated and pose environmental harm. On our side, the International Seabed Authority is the sole legitimate provider, so the destruction of the environment will not happen. On their side, customary of the United States on our side becomes illegal under the international law on our side. Now, I'll take a point.
If companies are threatening to overpass the ISA, what makes you believe that they will abide by your regulation on your own?
Okay, thank you for your point. Now, this is a point that all of you will have to believe, that there is nothing to legally bind the United States for these regulations. Panama, the United States of America, is the only country in the entire world that is not a signatory of the conventions of the rights of the child. Now, do you really think that the United States is not obligated to respect the conventions of the child and the rights of every children? Of course it is. This convention only crystallizes the customary international law, Panama, which means that a violation constitutes an intentional wrongful act which triggers state responsibility and makes the state liable to stop the violation and to pay for reparation of damages. That is exactly what we achieve through the legalization of deep sea mining. So we're moving on our impacts. Firstly, we avoid uncontrolled massification of deep sea mining because we ensure that the International Seabed Authority is the only organism able to provide these licenses, giving the control to the scale and the parts of deep sea mining. This is relevant panel because the International Seabed Authority's regulatory framework is stricter than any other parallel license system that they may bring on their side. On their side, the parallel frameworks are more harmful for the environment. But secondly, we shut down the United States desestabilization of the international community. On their comparative, the deep sea mining proliferates in parallel means to the International Seabed Authority. So the environmental impact is worse because there is no sort of regulation whatsoever. Now, on our second argument, a green world through a blue planet. The thesis of this argument is that immediately legalizing deep sea mining is the only way to ensure a global scale of energy transition. Now, as we explained on our setup, the many uses of rare earth minerals for clean energy, as we brought, for example, solar panels or electric vehicles. On the status quo, the control of these minerals is concentrated in China. The 90% of these minerals are in the control of China. Deep sea mining, on our side, democratizes these minerals. Now, how does this contribute to the energy transition? Firstly, because we give more access to rare earth minerals. The United States Convention Law of the Sea research says that there is a higher concentration on the deep sea than anywhere in the land. Now, this having a higher concentration, having more supply, according to the law of demand and supply, leads to a lowering of the price, a lowering of the cost for renewable energy, which ultimately creates incentives to transition to the new renewable energy. But secondly, it is in the hands of an international body, not a single state, not China. In the status quo, the entire supply chain is in the hands of China, which is extremely important to consider, taking into account the trade war that has been going on. On our side, we democratize this. But we also tell you that it is far less harmful for both the environment because it has a smaller carbon footprint, and our framework ensures that there is the smallest environmental harm, as opposed to a status quo where mining destroys the area and people often in near rural villages have to be displaced. But also it is better for society because we mitigate all the negative impacts that land mining has on the people who are being exploited in countries like the Congo. So on our impacts, we see increased supply of rare minerals and a reduced carbon footprint, but also the reduction of human rights abuses. So hard to propose.
Two things in my speech. First of all, 3 points of rebuttal, second on the framing, and then our first subtending. About the first point of rebuttal, about them saying that we have been restricted for the past 9 years, we're at a really good point of regulation, and that will be enough. Panel, this is only true for critical minerals, nickel, manganese, etc., non-rare earths, which the motion and the clarification states we're specifically talking about. They're debating an entirely different motion. In reality, only 97% of research for deep sea mining is related to critical minerals and only 3% for rare earths. And also, for rare earths, there are only 4 ongoing research projects. Why is this distinction important? Because we cannot apply what we know for critical minerals to rare earths. Critical minerals lie in polymetallic nodules, potato-sized rocks that lie on the surface and are really easy to locate and then pick up. Rare earths are located under thick layers of rocks that you need to crush in order to access them, making them harder to locate and extract. Bottom line is, the research we have so far isn't enough for rare earths, and gathering the sufficient will be extremely hard. Second point of rebuttal about regulation. They say that it would regulate and prevent armament racing by the US. Mind you, panel, the US isn't even part of the ISA. So this point is symmetrical because the US wouldn't abide to the regulation that they would impose. And on our side, they tell that if we don't legalize immediately, it would happen in an unregulated way regardless. 3 max on why this is not true. Firstly, companies and countries aren't threatening to mine without ISA concept. They're putting pressure on the ISA in order to develop the mining code as fast as possible, but this could be done in a short amount of time for critical minerals, but not for rare earths, as I previously explained, as we know too little about that. Secondly, they're not ready to do it immediately, even if you legalize it immediately or you don't legalize it. They don't have the machinery, haven't conducted the research, they don't know the techniques on how to do it. And third, and very start deep sea commercial mining, not even researchers without the ISA consent. So the ISA doesn't have the authority on the area to tell them not to start. Third point of rebuttal about favoring the monopoly of China on deep sea mining on our side. We tell you that on your side, you don't solve the problem because China is so advanced based on the tech and exploration they've had with the seabed, that if you legalize it immediately, they have a far greater advantage that they would do in 15 years, 20 years, when they do give time to other countries to catch up. And mind you, China won't still get ahead in the meantime for the principle of marginal utility. Once China reaches a certain point of research, it becomes so advanced that it's extremely hard and expensive. They will proceed slowly. All other countries need to do is become competitive, is to proceed in the first super fast, easy research. Now onto our framing. 2 points on this. First of all, purpose clearly overstating the urgency of legalizing deep sea mining. Why? First of all, because land-based mining will still provide enough resources to meet demand for so much time. Second, the perceived urgency Probe talks about relies on the fact that in about 20 to 30 years, we will reach a tipping point which will become more expensive to mine on land. But we tell you that until we reach that tipping point, which is definitely not immediately, we can still use effectively land-based mining or look into other alternatives instead of immediately resorting to deep sea mining, which would be harmful. Second point on that, why would immediate legalization make it harmful? We will expand further on our first stop, but the premise is that we don't have enough research, as I already stated. This means we know nothing about this target mineral, and this is harmful because you cannot regulate what you don't know, not taking into account the possible harms due to disruption of the environment. So based on that, what does side opposition stand for? Our model would postpone the legalization of deep sea mining to when we meet two criteria. First of all, we have gathered enough research to predict the environmental harms of deep sea mining. And second, once we have this research, we periodically, for example, once every 5 years, compare it to the environmental harms and effectiveness of other methods of obtaining rare earths, for example, land-based mining or recycling. And if this cost-benefit analysis points out to deep sea mining as the most convenient option, we legalize it. Otherwise, if it's not convenient, there is no need to do so, so we don't do it. In this time frame, the ISA would issue contracts to private companies and governments to conduct research under its guidance to assess results and assure compliance. Considering site op is open to legalizing deep sea mining once we prove that it is necessary, the only delta in this debate and is what proposition needs to prove to win, that legalizing deep sea mining is necessary now. If they don't, we win, because all of the other benefits are symmetrical. To win, we will demonstrate that legalizing deep sea mining now will outweigh any potential benefit and harm of other methods. But we won't stop at that. Through our two arguments, we will prove that, first of all, by postponing legalization, we get better deep sea mining, and second, that we are exclusively able to find other better alternatives to deep sea mining. Then, onto our question about making better mining and better research, maybe before we go on to take the point.
You don't indicate to that one how there is enough information on rare earth minerals, but even so, please indicate to the fact that these still have as a your side just without regulation.
I literally gave you 3 layers of mechanization in my framing about why it wouldn't happen. Please don't make me lose time. You didn't listen to the beginning of my speech. Now, onto our first understanding about postponing legalization, making for better research and better mining. Given Prop's framing of the motive for deep sea mining being decreasing environmental harms, we take into account that both sides here. But how is Prop unable to do this? Because as per framework, there is currently insufficient research regarding the process and impacts of deep sea mining for rare earth elements, as I previously mechanized. Therefore, harm is likely, because we don't even know what species live in the crust, how resilient they are, if there are marine species that only live in one bed and cannot otherwise be discovered. Current rare earth destruction methods require us to physically obliterate habitats that are home to delicate life forms, and we don't even know where these earths are located. So companies will use trial and error methods disturbing vast areas to locate profitable sites. What's the impact of this? Destruction of deep sea ecosystem that took millennia to form and cannot be restored once disturbed. We care about this because the death of species unknown to science means the loss of potential scientific and pharmaceutical breakthroughs. For instance, species of deep sea ocean sponges will have promising benefits for cancer treatment, and also the disruption of organisms crucial for carbon cycle, that causing large-scale carbon release from sediments. But the bigger issue is that we don't even know what other risks there could be. There are organisms that haven't even seen sunlight ever. Any sort of disturbance could potentially be destructive. What this means is that on proposition, environmental harm is certain, unpredictable, and not mitigatable. Not worth, therefore, the benefits of immediate legalization. That would only be there if it were urgent, but we prove to you that it's not. On opposition, we gain time to conduct the following research about seafloor mapping to understand where the earths are, baseline ecological assessments to identify the ecosystems, and technological development to invent and refine extraction techniques that minimize seafloor disruption. What this allows us to do is, first of all, to predict harm so that models can predict whether the cost of seabed mining is a worthy trade-off for the increased supply of rare earths, to reduce harm by knowing what harm is likely, how it can be reduced, and by testing out how to reduce it, and creating regulations such as that mining is limited to practices that limit harms. 3 layers of incentive of why this research is likely to occur on our side. First of all, we tell you model that the ISA will issue contracts to do so. Second, it's not 100% certain whether land-based mining will be reliable in decades from now on. So countries that rely on them for their economies will have an incentive to find other ways to source them through deep-sea mining and environmentally sustainable research because of our contracts. And third, empirically, we have conducted research for critical minerals even before legalization, and there are similar, if not greater, economic incentives to source rare earths. But mind you, as of right now, we're not at a good point. We figured out that critical minerals existed way before rare earths, so we're way ahead. Rare earths need a lot more time. So when our comparative, we will be able to access crop same benefits, albeit in some time, but with lower and predictable economic costs. This is a trade-off that we're willing to take, given that the environmental harms are irreversible because of the uniqueness of the species and because of the infrastructure for mining becomes locked, and it's hard to adapt in environmental regulations once it is built immediately. Remember the burden I explained at the beginning? Through this argument, I proved to you that A, legalizing deep-sea mining would now cause harms and that outweigh any potential benefit, and 2, we access no benefits without the harms. Please oppose.
And let us show you why deep-sea mining is actually likely to happen. It is important and we need it because we can't fit the demand of rare earth minerals in the present and in the future. And actually, this is the only way in which we can have a legal framework that is going to prevent further environmental damages that are going to happen on the other side of the house. Let me continue and expand on what has been presented by our first speaker. Firstly, we told you that deep-sea mining will exist. And we present you many ways in which to show that this is likely to occur. We presented that there are many countries in the world that are taking exploration licenses, not because they want to see how beautiful deep seas are, but because they actually have a means to an end. They want to explore the deep seas because they find that this could be useful in the future. So why would you spend so many resources on something that is expensive if you're not planning to do something in the future with this? We also told you that representatives in the US session in the last ISA meeting said that this contract on deep sea is not mandatory and it does not prohibit them from actually deep sea mining. So what we're seeing here is that countries are having incentives such as military purposes or green energy transitions that drive them to think that this is necessary, they need to do this immediately. And if there are not regulations, they will be forced to do this, even if there are not international regulations. So countries are saying, I need the regulations now, whether you do it or I will have to continue because I have the necessity of doing this. We also told you that there is a necessity for a legal framework and that this is not going to be improvised panel. We told you that this draft on the regulations that are going to occur on deep sea mining has been continuing since 2013. And we also told you that the larger half is not only drafted, but it has already been approved by the countries that are part of the International Seabed Authority. So what we're telling you is that we are only discussing the minimum details and the commas that are going to be in the document. It has already been drafted to its completely. So we are not focusing on this is going to be improvised. We don't have enough information. We told you that we already do because the draft has been finished and we are discussing this in the moment. We're having the 30th session of the ISA on how we can regulate and finish the draft this month. The objective is to finish it this month. So we're telling you that we actually have the information and it already has being prepared. We are not doing this in the moment. We also told you that we gave plenty of examples like Israel that's being used for military purposes, and countries are not going to want to be left behind for the US to continue and have a military advantage for them and use it as leverage. So they are going to be forced to continue if the US continues and there's no legal framework. We tell you that this is detrimental to the house. Lastly, we told you that without the ISA, we're going to have no regulations. This looks like, for example, having no protected zones and having no legitimate regulatory body doing this. Let's learn more on this, on what has been presented by the other team. Firstly, on rare earth minerals and the investigation, they told you that there's only investigation of strategic minerals like nickel, and we're not going to have any information whatsoever on these specific minerals we're talking about.
3
Three answers here. Firstly, we told you that countries have an incentive to actually look for and investigate on these resources because they have to use it for a green transition.
Yeah.
We're talking here about European countries, for example, and also for military purposes. In the present, we're having 31 mineral exploration contracts to 21 in 20 countries. Countries have incentives to actually be doing this. Our second answer is that we're telling you that in the same nodules in which we have these strategic minerals we're talking about, we have investigation on. There, we have also the rare earth minerals. In the same nodules, you have the same resources. So if you investigate on those strategic minerals we're talking about, you are investigating too on these rare earth minerals. Our last answer is on the deep database of the ISA. We're telling you that since 2019, the ISA has been developing a database on investigation. So the actual and legitimate regulatory body is the one that is carrying on these investigations for the sake of the environment. We tell you that we have information. For more than 10 years we have been investigating. When is it going to be enough? Countries want to do this now. We cannot further postpone this into the future. But before I move on to our second answer on technical.
Please engage with the fact that we told you that the research for critical minerals cannot be applied to rare earths because they are so substantially different in how to locate them and how to extract them.
Thank you very much. So the other team has not presented any mechanization whatsoever as to why these resources are going to be in different parts of the ocean. They never presented, for example, we're telling you that in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, in which we have the majority of these resources, we have the resources they're talking about on strategic minerals like nickel, but in those same nodules, we're having rare earth minerals. You're investigating on both. Our second answer is them saying that we are not going to be able to continue with deep sea and that countries have no incentive to use this other alternative because they can cover the demand of these minerals with the land mining we already have. We told you that China is in 60% of the control of land mining and even further control on the production of these resources. So it is strategic for countries to want to have control over their own supply chain, and they actually have incentives to look for an alternative to have sovereignty over these important resources we tell you that are critical for the development of their countries. And lastly, on environmental harms. We're actually flipping this. They tell you that we're going to have more environmental harms on our side of the house because we're actually going to damage all these important species that are going to be in the site we're going to be mining. We tell you here that this is going to be even worse if we don't have a regulatory body here. They tell you, and we accept, that countries have an incentive to actually further continue with this exploration and exploitation of resources. So, as we tell you that they have the incentive to do this, if we don't provide a regulatory body and framework, they are going to continue, but there's going to be no limitations on what countries can and can't do. We're telling you that our side of the house, we set sustainable mining standards. This looks like the supervision of the ISA, like providing environmental guidelines such as protected zone, phase exploitation, and mandatory impact assessments. No, thank you. We're also telling you that we're going to have less environmentally harmful extraction methods and more regular damage reports. So it is actually better on our side of the house. And we're also telling you that society is going to be involved because we're going to have a fair competition. This is going to call for the attention of the people, and we're going to have higher standards and accountability set by media scrutiny. So let's move on to our last piece of discussion on the expansion. We told you on the democratization of resources. Our main point here is that the ISA should immediately legalize deep mining because it sets a fair global resource extraction system from the beginning, aligning with the democratic division of these resources. We told you two main things here. The first one is that the ISA has already established the creation of a fund that's going to be redistributed the profits. In simple terms, this looks like the draft separating the world in 8 different zones, and each sector is going to have funds with the profits of the companies in that sector that produce. So we're telling you that this is going to be distributed among the countries, and this is not going to happen with no legal framework. So we're telling you that our side of the house, we're integrating developing nations and international actors in the mining industry of rare earth minerals, and we're actually fighting for these resources to be democratic. And our second point, we're telling you that there's going to be a division on technology. There is a specific part on the draft that says that technology has to be shared. So this looks like countries being able to share their technology through, for example, internships and capacity building for developing states, joint research and development projects, and licensing or donation for mining technology and knowledge. This is important because we're ensuring that all actors have access to both resources and technology to develop in this industry. So,
Side competition comes up and brings blatant lies, they lose
responses to this. The first one, that the US is not interested in deep sea mining at all, several mechanization. The logical pump and the intuition pump is that most of the countries that are actually interested in deep sea mining are doing something politically to try to incentivize and to bring the model. We see this in China, for example, right? Who even in politics is pushing for deep sea mining. We don't see it at all for the United States. Second response, the United States has never asked for licenses. This is just like empirically untrue. We tell you that the only 4 countries who have asked for licenses are Russia, China, South Korea, and Canada. But even in this case, this does not represent a problem for our side because we only ask for licenses to do research, not to do commercial interest and market of deep sea mining. So this is not an issue for us, but again, the US is not even in the countries that are interested in doing the research. Why would they be interested in doing deep sea mining?
You know why?
But then C, the US does not even have the technology. It hasn't invested in any project. It is definitely not the right example. The only claim that stands on their side when it comes to the US is the point on TMC, developed company, right? However, several mechanisms as to why the TMC will not do deep sea mining either way. Because A, the TMC is actually focused on polymetallic nodules, as most of the research on deep sea mining. So they're not interested on rare earth mineral. This example does not even matter when on this motion at all. But then D, the US cannot sponsor the ISA, the TMC directly, as they are not a member of the ISA, as my first speaker said. So the system that allows countries to sponsor a company is not applicable in this case. What can happen then is that the USA sponsors the TMC as a country.
You know
this
why?
is highly unlikely because it is an extremely lengthy process unless you do it with the ISA. Because it looks like having a proposal in Congress, then a discussion in Congress, then a vote, then an agreement being stipulated. And the agreement, we tell you, is even more unlikely, insofar that the USA has already invested in other supply chains, like the one in Ukraine. So we tell you that the situation where the United States themselves pay for the TMC is very, very high likely, and either way, extremely lengthy. It does not apply to their case on immediate legalization and on the immediate urgency. So this strategic mistake obviously falls. The second strategic mistake is on basing their case on polymetallic nodules. A, they don't even know the difference between polymetallic nodules and rare earths. We bring this in first speech, they completely ignore it in second speech. B, we tell you that they are significantly different because for extraction of the polymetallic nodules, the technology is a different technology. The one needed for rare earths is a lot more complex because rare earths are crusted. They are deeper in the sea. They are far more complex to explore. Hence, the presence of research on polymetallic nodules and the lack of research on rare earths instead. But then D, they try to push the idea that in nodules there are rare earths, which is simply untrue. In polymetallic nodules, you find polymetallic nodules, such as cobalt. In rare earths supply, then you find rare earths. These are two completely different things. They cannot simply ignore scientific facts. But then their only response on this claim is that they have the incentive to do research. Of course you have the incentive to do research. This is exactly our case, right? But the thing is that you cannot legalize it without having the research yet, because that means that you're going to do something without knowing the harms that will come with it. When we tell you that the deep sea collects most of the carbon that is present in the air, and we have a huge problem with carbon in the air, we cannot risk disrupting entire seabeds and killing millions of organisms just because we want to do research, when we can access those benefits on our side without the harms that come with it. But then secondly, we tell you that the research on their side is also way worse because it is profit-driven, not research-driven. Third strategic mistake, basing their case on regulation, but at the same time, assuming that countries will override the ISA instead. Which one is it? Either you respect the regulations and then you access your impacts, or you don't, and then you lose all of your impacts either way. Now, in their second speech, they try to shift the case on lack of resources. Several responses on why lack of resources is not urgent. We tell you that demand can still be met with land-based supply because total global rare earth reserves exceed 130 million metric tons. Annual production is about 300,000 metric tons. So even if the production and the demand were to triple, we would still be able to access that demand with the supply that we have on rare earth. But then we tell you the scientific and technological development may make deep sea mining even unnecessary because new land discoveries are still ongoing. In 2023, we discovered Europe's largest rare earth deposit. In criteria in third, but we have even other responses. So go ahead and try. Before I move on, I will respond to what you like.
Isn't lithium and the studies that you're naming Isn't lithium and the studies that you're naming critical minerals instead of rare earth minerals?
Absolutely, yes, those are critical minerals. Yes, you find them in polymetallic nodules, the ones that the research is based on, not the ones that the motion is tackling. This is the entire problem with your case. Thank you. Now, really quickly on environmental harms instead. They say that they're able to predict the environmental harms. We tell you that A, this is factually untrue because, as I already said, we know more polymetallic nodules, not reefs. But what we know, even if we knew something, comes from shallow exploration, which does not apply at scale because deep sea mining and the deep sea is vastly more complex. But then C, even if some raw arms can be predictable, specific inputs like microbial carbon processes are not predictable. And we give you an intuition fund. We tell you that these organisms have never seen light and sound, right? We're not able to predict how they will react to sound. But we also tell you that extraction without sound is currently not feasible. So we tell you that the moment you go down there without knowing how it works, then you risk disrupting the entire deep sea without accessing anything. Now, moving on to the third argument, because we have two paths to victory. The first one is proving that there is no urgency and that we are able to access better research in the long term. The second one is proving that we also access another type of research. What is the issue? We tell that delaying legislation incentivizes research in recycling and rare earth substitutes and ensuring responsible use of mined materials in the future. We tell that since the REE are limited and there is uncertainty over deep sea mining, governments are incentivized to find ways to make the most out of existing supply. This incentivizes two types of explorations on our side: rare earth recycling technology and rare earth substitutes. The problem is that companies only have so much capital to invest. When site acquisition opens a new market, which seems easier and quicker and which is new, they invest in it. They cannot try to push back on this because it is the only method that keeps their site on standards. Mind you, however, that deep sea mining is extremely costly, and the constant development to adapt to the regulations that they're improving on their side is even more costly. This means that they won't have capital to invest in recycling and material substitution. We tell you that the potential impacts of recycling are extremely devastating. They shift the resources on circular design. This reduces the overall demand for rare earths. But then, once a country gains access to rare earths, they are able to regenerate the majority of them. This leads to a bigger stockpile, decreasing monopolization on supply. So we tell you that we're able to access research on substitutes and on recycling on our side, something that is not that they cannot do. It's so clear, both for side of opposition.
Opposition wants you to believe that this is a dispute between with and without Seabed mining. Notice how on our first, we characterize you as status quo in which the US is literally giving licenses for deep sea mining and in which China is seeking in the Pacific for deep sea mining. What we prove you is that we have to prove that if ISA regulations are able to impose on our side of the house, we shall win this debate. Notice, panel, how opposition tried to tackle these examples by telling you that they weren't part of the debate, but never really engaged on mechanizing why, in the lapses within our legalization and their future legalization, they will have no deep sea mining whatsoever. Our mechanization on how China has incentive to seek for it, on how the US has incentive to seek for it, on how the US is giving licenses for seeking this are still standard. Therefore, at least third of suddenly mechanizing how they are going to impose that no one else deep sea mining on the continuation of this draft. Therefore, they shall lose this debate. Opposition then, on the second, try to outframe us by telling you that they are the only ones engaging in our cycle economy. Notice, panel, how first, this contradicts their point of demand. Why? Because if they have so much rare earth minerals, then no one is doing a circular economy. And if we have so much demand for rare earth minerals, therefore we don't see how recycling is exclusive to their side of the house. If we were to optimize resources, as we are telling you, all mechanisms, more extraction, more recycling, will collaborate on our side. Therefore, we don't see how this debate. Two main questions then that I was able to identify in this debate. Firstly, on urgency, then on sustainability. So from first prop, we told you that there was an issue with proliferation, with the proliferation of unregulated licenses on their side of the house. Why? Because there was a strategic need for rare earth minerals for not only for military industry, but for renewable resources. Therefore, when the US accesses these metals, all countries seek to access them. Again, this is what China is doing, this is what the US is doing. It's not a lie, they are not doing so. Therefore, there is a strong incentive for them to seek these minerals outside of ISA on status quo. we gave you two mechanisms on how we avoid this. Firstly, by telling you that by banning this, we set a precedent on what you can do or not, which is unclear on the status quo. Notice how first proposition gave you a preemptive regulations on their point on how the US will not abide those regulations. Why? Because on the status quo, by not having regulations, the US has no regulations to actually follow. And how instead in other drafts, such as Child Rights Act, they do follow it, even though they haven't signed it, and if they break it, believe me, the international courts will sanction them. But secondly, we told you that we disincentivize parallel means of deep sea mining. Why, panel? Because ISA has a lot of prestige, because these private companies have been engaging with it with so much time, because these licenses ensure communication and collaboration. Notice how this mechanism wasn't pretty engaged by the opposition yet, and therefore are still standing in this debate. What is the main push that we wait from opposition? First, they try to tell you that companies will not follow these regulation drafts, right? Because they have no incentives to do so on our side of the house. Firstly, we believe that this is the case because basically if they don't follow the licenses and the regulations, they lose them, they lose the benefit of rare earth minerals which are a very, very valuable resource. Therefore, they have a natural incentive to abide to regulations. But secondly, that competition between companies that we have on our side of the house, engaging them to continue with these regulations. Let's look at a fishing panel. When a fishing company doesn't follow regulation, other fishing company denounce that false and therefore loses its market. Therefore, the competition that we create on our side of the house incentivize them to follow our regulations that we are standing. Therefore, this push on that no one will follow the regulations has fallen from the opposition. And secondly, they try to make you believe that we don't need so much resources. There is not that urgency for these resources. Firstly, they assume here that we can put so much pressure on land mining, when in reality, land mining is a practice that destroys the quite worse the environment that seabed mining does. Why? Firstly, because it affects local communities, intoxicates the rivers. Secondly, because it destroys terrestrial extraction as much or more than seabed mining does. Therefore, on their counterfactual, by putting more pressure on land extraction, by putting more pressure on land mining, they also generate a much higher destruction on their side of the house. Therefore, this point of we don't need resources is still standing on our side of the house. But secondly, notice how all these statistics that opposition tries to bring you were about critical minerals, the one that they try to bring on our side of the house. We tell you that the US is literally seeking in the Clarion Clipper zone, which was the Matis control, they are seeking for rare earth minerals. These metal minerals have rare earth minerals panels. We don't see how opposition tried to lie to you, saying that these metal minerals didn't have that minerals. The US, in this zone, with the metal companies, is seeking among all these minerals that opposition needs to, also rare earth minerals. This is standing on our side of the house. So why have we won this clash? Firstly, because even if we tell you that we don't need much of these resources yet, and even if the information is not such as complete as opposition wants to with it, still the fact that on their side of the house we have a proliferation of much more unregulated, uncontrolled practices makes us win this clash. Why? Because they get much more environmental hazards, much more damage from these unregulated licenses. So before going with our second clash, I think I'll be white.
On your side, you're gonna be a both land-based mine, which is destructive, and deep sea mining, which is destructive as well. On our side, we just have land-based mining. Please indicate that.
Yes, but the fact that now on our side of the house, we have to fill that extra demand with land, with sea mining, instead of with land mining, necessarily takes pressure out of land mining. Why do we need this panel? For example, in the opposition's future in 2030, all of this extraction will come from land mining. Meanwhile, on our side of the house, not all that extraction will come from land mining, some will come from seabed mining. Therefore, it's natural to believe that we'll have less earth mining on our side of the house. Second question on sustainability. So opposition makes you believe that we're going to destroy an unknown environment that we have no knowledge about. What were our mitigations here? Firstly, that on our side, we impose a regulatory framework that has some considerations towards this environment. On the comparative, they have none on this. But secondly, that land mining is worse, that land mining also generates a lot of environmental hazard. Therefore, it's not like the alternative is much better on their side of the house. But thirdly, that the improvement and technological development that we have achieved by the collaboration of all countries, definitely in the future will be able to mitigate all these environmental hazards. First, then they try to, first proposition also present you a point on sustainable development, on how by decreasing the cost of rare earth minerals and by increasing its supply, we're naturally making the energy purchase easier panel, because it is less costly, because it will be much cheaper. Opposition tries to tell you that we are not going to diversify the supply chain on our side of the house. Why? Because China has so much knowledge. Notice how first this is contradictory to the point that we do not have knowledge on the seabed mining, rather China has the knowledge, or rather this knowledge doesn't exist. But secondly, this is a matter of supply. On the status quo, China has a monopoly on a majority of rare earth minerals. Meanwhile, in our counterfactual, companies from all around the world can access these rare earth minerals. Therefore, the diversification still is coming. Then they try to make a push on how we are destroying the environment that we don't know now that we don't have knowledge of on our side of the house. Firstly, then this assumes that they are going to impose, they are going to even impose this and to not have this practice on their side, which they haven't proven yet. But second, notice how ISA has been literally investigating some of interest for so many years. Giving a license implies, firstly, giving an exploration license panel. Therefore, that before any extraction, there is an investigation in that area. We saw that at first. Secondly, they try to make you believe this misconception, or with this name tree, rare earth minerals, they shall be inert. However, they aren't panel. They are in the noodles, the same noodles that we have investigated for so many years, the same noodles that we have present of extracting since 1982. Therefore, we do have the knowledge, we do have a picture on our side of the house. Please vote proposition.
Ready? Speech, sir. 3, 2. We haven't finalized the mining code for 25 years because of scientific environmental harms, geopolitical tensions, and disagreements over benefit sharing mechanisms. Side proposition never prove why we're going to solve them, how we're going to actually take the draft. They have one actually burden on their side, also proving the urgency. They didn't do that. This is why we win today. So 2 things in my speech. Firstly, a brief clarification on polymetallic nodules, critical minerals, and rare earths. And secondly, my rebuttal divided in urgency, research and development, environment, and geopolitics. Firstly, a clarification needed in order to actually continue this debate because it has been so messy. Critical minerals, which are nickel, copper, manganese, are located in polymetallic nodules, which are potato-sized rocks laid on the seabed. And in order to extract them, you simply have to vacuum them with suction processes, and they are located, for example, in the clarical zone. They have been cited for the whole debate. But this is not what we're talking about, and all the research we have today, 97% of research we have today, is for polymetallic nodules. All the drafts we have today are for polymetallic nodules. It's not what we're talking about. They've completely not understood the case. And no, thank you. While the rare earths are not located in polymetallic nodules. They are located in seafloor massive sulfides, in cobalt-rich crusts, in completely different places, and have completely different extraction methods because they are under thick layers of rock, and you need to crush the rock in order to access them. So they're completely depending on one another motion. Now, let me move on to my first point of rebuttal, the most important one, on the urgency. Firstly, we brought you so many mechanisms on why we have already the supply. So we have at least for 15 years, we are able also to focus on alternatives. They have never engaged with that. But now, on the most important one, push from side proposition, which is on our side, deep sea mining would happen anyway. Firstly, you're going against your own case, as if companies override the ISA. Then there is no reason to believe why on your side they're going to abide by your regulations. So there was no actual response to the POI. So their entire push actually falls, because even on their side, if they legalize it, companies are still going to be able to override the ISA if this is true. In fact, this is not true, because number one, there's no actual threat. Because number one, in the last 25 years, there have been just 4 active projects in the entire world. Number 2, some companies are not threatening to mine without the ISA consent. They're just putting pressure in order to get the mining code as soon as possible. Number 3, the pressure is not even for rare earths, because we have so little material. We're not ready for them. We're ready for maybe for the critical minerals. So the pressure is for legalizing the deep sea mining code in order to deep sea mine the critical minerals. And why do we have so few material? What does it look like? We don't have the machinery. We haven't conducted the research. We don't know the techniques to do it without completely destroying the environment. On environment, I'll talk about later. Number 4, they're investing much more in land-based. You've talked about the US for the entire speech, but the US has just signed the Trump-Zelensky agreement to secure the rare earth supply from land-based activities. their priority is not actually the deep sea mining. And
Yeah.
number 5, in 40 years of the ISA history, no country or companies has started deep sea commercial mining and not even researchers without the ISA consent. So the ISA does have the authority of the area. If they don't give contracts, companies do not start it. Moreover, they talk about US giving licenses to do so. But first, this is factually untrue because we've never got a license in order to do deep sea mining, either research or exploitation, without the ISA consent.
Yeah,
and not even in the ISA. So this actually doesn't stand. And they also bring the point of Nauru issuing licenses. This is false and simply ridiculous because how would Nauru be able to do deep sea mining that requires billions of dollars to be done? Moreover, they don't actually bring you real evidences in order to do so. The unique example come out of this debate was the metals company. But first, the metals company is focused on polymetallic nodules again in the clear zone, right? But which contains polymetal, which contains critical minerals, not rare earths like neodymium or dysprosium. And they are, as we already said, they are in different places, require different technologies. They're not even mapped. They're not ready to do so. And they also talk about incentives for the US. But first, the US is not a member of the ISA, so actually it would even be unable to sponsor them. But even if it was the case, it would take a lot of time. It would need a proposal in the Congress, discussion, vote, and then an agreement, which is highly unlikely just because they've secured their supply with the Trump-Zelensky agreement. So this is highly unlikely to happen. And moreover, they would face so huge consequences if they did so. For the TMC, because they would be violating international norms, and we would be unable to export materials to jurisdictions that demand the ISA compliance, they demand the environmental compliance, like the European Union, Japan, so they would lose more than half of their market. So they are highly not incentivized to do so. And also for the US, because if it is not legalized, they would have much more spotlight and would face diplomatic backlash from the ICA member states, from the environmental blocs, and they would risk undermining the international law, which is sure not in the sense of the USA. So the no geopolitical free-for-all would happen on-site opposition. So there is no actual urgency, and their entire case is based on that. We win this point, we win this debate. But then, I move on to my second point, but let me take the PR.
So if the US doesn't want rare earth minerals, why is it sticking them in Ukraine? Why has it a license to the mineral company to extract them?
The US does want rare earth minerals. Simply they don't want them from the deep sea mining. I've already spent more than 1.5 minutes, I'm not going to repeat that. Now, briefly on research. They tell me that we have so much research, but again, we just have 4 active projects, 3% of research. It is so little. And they also talk about the draft, but actually the draft is for the polymetallic nodules again. There are no rare earths in polymetallic nodules. We have no draft for actually rare earths. And on the necessity of their research on their side, there would be even less research, and it will shift from an environment-driven on our side on a profit-driven on theirs, because they legalize. Companies have actually short-term incentives to do the deep sea mining in the cheapest and fastest way possible. So their research is going to shift towards another point, so the economically driven one. Now, on the environment. Firstly, they didn't prove that. They actually themselves tell you these rare earths are going to go to militarization, to the digitalization. So we actually don't see why they're actually going to go, for example, to the green transition. But even if they went there, we really provide you with so many mechanisms on why the harm is likely, because extraction methods require to physically obliterate habitats. And with no other guidelines, like on their side, companies are likely to resort to the more cost-effective methods. What are the impacts of this? Disruption of organisms crucial for the carbon cycle. Carbon release from disturbing sediments. So all of this is going to deploy the environment and harm it. Why our side is better? Because we need to analyze and quantify the environmental potential outcomes. We do further research on our side. We invest in alternatives, which is not possible in their side. We actually access to more benefits in the environment. Also because on their side, the shift won't happen. Because the upfront cost and technological barriers are enormous. And simply because companies that are doing deep sea mining, that would do deep sea mining, are simply different companies from the ones that are going to do land-based mining. On their side, we're going to have land-based mining, which is destructive, and deep sea mining, which is destructive. On our side, we're just going to have land-based mining. On the environment, we win. And lastly, on geopolitics, tackled a little in this debate, they say that they're democratizing actually the resources. But the monopoly would happen as well, as even if in the early stages, the most advanced between the countries is China. So they're going to have the monopoly as well, even in their case. And the one with the most capital to do so, with dumping government mechanism, with the willingness to maintain their monopoly, and competitors not as much interest. So on their side, they're going to have even the monopoly of China for deep sea mining. Also geopolitics, they lose. They lose all the debate. Thank you. Never be proud of who opposed.
Bye-bye. 3 questions, 3 problems, side opposition wins them all. Let's start with the first one, urgency. What does side opposition bring us? Mind you that this is the most important clash in this round because the motion specifically says that we should legalize it immediately. The burden of proof was a proof that the legalization is needed now. Urgency. They tell us, A, the US is threatening to do it anyway. We tell them, A, we first prove why the US example is simply wrong through 4 different mechanisms. Thea does it, I do it, Luca does it. The US example does not work at all. But then we also tackle their mechanization so that we can erode the problem in the first place. We tell them that the logic is also wrong. Because countries have no interest in overriding the ISA because of the lawsuits that may happen, because they cannot export to states that comply with the ISA, such as the EU, so it simply does not make sense for them to do it. But then secondly, we tell them that they don't have the technologies to do this in the first place. And then C, we also tell you that if their own mechanization works, then their case falls too, because countries now have no incentives to follow the regulations that reduces their profits. So either they don't access any influx and countries mine without the regulations on both sides, or they don't, or the mechanization doesn't stand. The second point they bring on urgency is that there is a lack of supply. But I've actually proved this through several different methods that this is factually untrue. And at their highest round, the lack of resources is a problem of the future. They never do any way showing why the lack of resources is a problem that needs to be tackled now. We tell you that it does not outweigh the harms that comes from doing deep sea mining without the needed research. So we outweigh this issue in the first place. Second question on sustainability. Well, they tell us that the harms can be predicted and regulation is enough. I give you 4 different mechanizations on why harms cannot be predicted. These 4 mechanizations in my speech have never been responded, so they still stand. But secondly, they can't prove that the shift from deep sea mining, from land-based mining to deep sea mining will happen, so they don't access the benefits of changing the supply system and on improving the environment. So they only get combined harm because they get both the harms of land supply and deep sea supply. At their highest round, we only get land-based supply. We still win on this. But then 3, we tell you that we weigh this clash on predictability because when the consequences are irreversible, the burden is much higher on side proposition. When the consequences that might happen are the complete disruption of the seabed, the emission of millions of tons of carbon in the air, the disruption of organisms that could be extremely useful in the medical field to solve issues like cancer research. As we tell you in the first speech, and it never goes responded, then the burden is really, really high. They never prove why this outweighs our claims. We win on predictability. We tell you that at their highest round, when proposition is wrong, there is complete and permanent damage. When opposition is wrong instead, we simply delay the process and get to have more research and get to understand the harms. On research then, we tell you that the issue on side proposition is that incentivized research is profit driven. Basically, you get data on how to mine more, not data that question the harms of deep sea mining. Bad data leads to bad policy, so they don't access the impacts of good regulations. On our side instead, we have several mechanisms in the first speech as to why research will happen. We tell you that there is an economic incentive because rare earths are required as they bring throughout the entire case. They are required on land, so there is an economic incentive to still try to do the research and to find new pathways. But then there is an untapped market, and if you don't buy, there is an empirical truth because we see that the research has happened in critical minerals, so it might happen on rare earths. And then we tell you that there is also an incentive in our model, which is the ISA issuing contracts, as they did with critical minerals, as they are going to do with rare earths. Research is something that both teams access. On our side, it is better. Geopolitics, we tell you that it is not an important clash in this round because side proposition never does the job of outweighing any of the potential harms that we bring you with the harms of geopolitics, and we are able to make them symmetrical by saying that China would monopolize even the deep sea beds because they're the only ones who have the research. Side proposition wins.
Explain why team opposition alternative is much more harming to the world, and we explain also how deep sea mining will still exist on their side, on their world, on their alternative. How that they didn't engage with these points, they didn't counteract our claims. That is why team proposition wins this debate. These two questions that summarize the debate. First question, is deep sea mining safe and responsible and counterfactual? And the second question, is there a true sense of urgency to legitimize deep sea mining, to legalize deep sea mining for rare minerals? I will tackle these two questions. Starting with the first one. Is deep sea mining safe and responsible in our counterfactual? The answer is yes. Now, team opposition pushed the measure of responsible mining as a burden to our side by saying that it harms the species of the deep sea and it ultimately harms the seabed because we're not doing it responsibly. Beware, panel, this is what we warned you in the start of our case. Opposition trying to have you believe that firstly, legalizing deep sea mining will be unresponsible, and secondly, that if we don't legalize, deep sea mining will not happen. We explained on our third argument how their attempt to outframe us completely fails, but we explained also on the start of our case how deep sea mining still happens on their side. We actually flipped this metric to show you how we protect the environment better on side proposition. Let's wait both first. Firstly, on their world, their alternative, as they create their wonderful alternative, is land mining. That we explain in our second argument how it provides many environmental harms to the land and the people who live there, but it also represents social harms to the people who are being exploited in land mining, something that they never engage with and never tackle on their side. But we also said that deep sea mining still happens on their side, just without the regulations to do it responsibly. So if they truly care about the environment, this case falls on their side because deep sea mining will still happen and it's something that they didn't tackle. Now on our world, we cut the harms of land mining, we make deep sea mining safer because it still happens on their side and without the regulations, and we also give more access to rare earth minerals. We provide the democratization of resources, something that they never fully engage with also on their side. So on some way, a quote from team opposition said that in proposition there is land mining and deep sea mining, which are both harmful, and opposition only has land mining. Now this proves two things. Firstly, that they concede the point that land mining is severely harmful, and that is their sole alternative, no that panel. But secondly, they did not engage with how deep sea mining still happens on their side. They say that we should delay the process as if this meant to just freeze time and everybody would just time would just stop for everybody. We explain that the International Seabed Authority delays, but other states do not, and will still pursue deep sea mining, and this is actually harmful, and that is what leads me to my second question on the urgency. Is there a true sense of urgency to legitimize deep sea mining for rare earth minerals? Answer, yes. We prove this through three main ways, despite team proposition attempt to outframe us, as we said that the deal is almost finished, so there is enough information. Firstly, on the urgency of resources, and then they undermine this point. We explain how it is important for the states, for the military, and for renewable energy. But secondly, on the threats from the United States. Remember that they also try to undermine this point by saying that we only focus on them. But this is important. There is yet no regulatory framework, and the United States is so close to pursuing deep sea mining on their own. This will set a race to diminish their competitive advantages, something that they also never engage with. They say that the states will not respect the deal. That is something that they were with the debate. We contested that on our first speech by saying that by bringing customary international law, states will have to abide. The real harm is if the states start doing this without the actual framework, the International Civil Authority loses its leverage for all the affairs of the sea on their side. So, but thirdly, we talked about the concentration of resources of China in the status quo. Now, this is very harmful, and their alternative is not only harmful for the environment, but also concentrates the monopoly on the middle of an ongoing trade war panel.